To our debaters for taking their time today to help us examine your important issues. To Sherry Fesh in the back, who's really the center of ethics and leadership. I have the name before she does all the work, so thank you very much, Sherry. To Allison McIntyre and Kimberly Griffin in Foundation Relations for helping my office secure the external support for today's debate. To the Charles Koch Foundation for co-sponsoring today's event, so we bring Mr. Blackman on your lots. And all of you for listening to the Spirit of Word Talk. So a year ago at this time, it became clear that foreign and domestic policy would be front and center during the presidential election. That is, how the United States conducts war abroad and how immigration law here in the 50 states would change. That in mind, I thought a year ago, we should now have two people debate the presidential powers in those two areas so we can be informed voters going in to the election itself. So our debaters have actually crossed over before for a long, long time, and I did not know. Right? I contacted them completely independently of one another, and they said, "Oh, we're old friends. We know how this works." So,
friends is putting it gently.
Well, anyway, they're helping us to hear.
Lovers?
They're here to help us.
Unrequited lovers.
Well, whatever it is, they're going to help us sort out some of these basic positions on presidential power. They're going to spell out their positions and respond to each other. What they're going to do is they're going to go 15 minutes, and the other's going to go 15 minutes. It will be a 5-minute response and a 5-minute response. I will keep them honest, well, at least with respect to time, by showing our time cards in the front so you may see me single as we go. And I've built in 20 minutes when they're done with their constructive, destructive portions of the debate for you all to ask questions. So I hope you can stick around after the 40 minutes is over. So if you have any questions about what you heard and how that plays out, they're more than happy. We also have some key documents here on the left that they will refer to in the course of the debate itself. So if you want a copy of one of the documents they refer to, just raise your hand. Maybe Sherry and I, Victoria, can keep our eye on that. And if you want to follow along at home, we have copies. They were also available on Eventbrite. So sign up for this. I realize that not everybody can stay to 12:30, much less 1 o'clock, which we block the room. So if you need to leave, just do so discreetly, right? It doesn't bother us at all, and certainly they won't take it as a if any students are here, need to show your instructor that you're here for extra credit. We have sign-in sheets.
Oh, that's the incentive. That's why they're here.
So if you need to show your instructor you're here, please do sign in, and we'll make sure your instructor finds out that you're here long enough to sign in. The table in the back also has all sorts of event notices for things we're doing the rest of the semester, including, I think it was with me Thursday, Alex Toma from Security and Peace Funders, who used to be an aide to a congressional representative, is going to be here 4:30. Is it like 3:15? 3:05 on Friday, Thursday. And she's going to talk about what people on the Hill and Congress and Senate think about the upcoming presidential debate. So if you're interested, and her husband's also a congressional aide, so
they're all unhappy.
they're all happy.
I think there are about 46 senators who are pretty happy.
Okay. Well, if you want to hear about that, Washington Insiders,
Excluding
Alex
Bernie.
Toma will be here on Thursday. Please feel free to get out and get more food if you want. We have plenty of pizza and salad and dessert and whatnot. You should have on your chair a blue and white feedback form. Please don't leave without telling us what you thought of today's event. There should be a place on that form also for you to suggest other events. We're very, very open to the campus community. If there's something we should be talking about, let us know, and we'll put it on the agenda for the future. And before you leave, that filled out form on your seat, you can go on the back table. You're the extra credit sign-in sheet. One final remark. This event here, and we're very happy to have engaging, civil, and robust debate. This is not a political rally, right? We're not here to endorse Clinton or Trump or Stein or Johnson or whoever you tend to write in, right?
Alexander Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton.
Second.
You have the right to vote for them, of course, if you're 18 and registered and you're not a felon, and all the other requirements going.
God bless Texas.
But we are here today to have a debate about presidential power. So we're going to ask you, get some Q&A section, and I will moderate this. No grandstanding, no punditry, no keep America great, or
That's for us to do.
Better together. None of that. Right? It's an intellectual discussion. You can leave the politics out in the public forum, which is right now it's not.
We're weaker together.
I think that covers everything. If I didn't miss anything. And then, Josh, you are recording?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I got recording going.
So you might want to keep that in mind.
Nah.
It's on the internet, it's forever. So you can decide using your own content what kind of question to ask, except for they get a political stump speech, I'm not going to let you do that. Right? That's not fun. So with that in mind, I'm going to read the title of the day's debate and say a little bit about our presenters as debaters, and then get out of the way so they can debate. So the title is Presidential Powers Debate. Presidential powers over immigration and in war. How will the next president use executive power domestically and abroad? Our debaters on the left are Josh Blackman from the Houston College of Law and author of Unraveled Obamacare, Religious Liberty and Executive Power, Cambridge in 2016. And Steve Vladeck here on the right, who's recently UT Texas Law School. Is a Supreme Court analyst for CNN, co-author of Aspen Publishers' leading national security law and counterterrorism law. So before they get started, let's get them to say their phone.
I'll go first. I usually go first. That way Steve can tell me why I'm wrong. It actually works better this way. So my sincere thanks over at St. Edward's for inviting me, and the good professor and my good friend Steve for being on my other side. This will be a civil debate. And what we'd like to talk about today is, he's rolling his eyes already. What we'd like to talk about today is how the current state of executive power will inform what the next president does. And really, our topic works regardless of who wins the election, whether it's Trump or Clinton. And in this sense, presidents always build on what the presidents before them do. When people come into office and say, you know what, I'm going to be different, right? I'm going to use executive power in a more moderate way. But when they actually get into that office, suddenly they find a new source of power that can perhaps serve their benefit. And President Obama is perhaps a classic example. He came into office trying to oppose the excesses of the Bush administration and quickly discovered that, to his own suiting, executive power is useful. But he did so in a very different way, and this is what I'd like to discuss. President George W. Bush's vision of executive power was based on Article 2 of the Constitution. Article 2 of the Constitution says that you are the commander-in-chief. And with this comes certain inherent powers. What does inherent mean? They're not written down. They're within the office. And President Bush used these sorts of inherent powers to a lot of things that people may not particularly like, involving Guantanamo Bay, enhanced interrogation techniques, and very aspects of war making in response to September 11th. The Obama presidency has been a very different species altogether. To their credit, and I mean this sincerely, they have not relied on a robust notion of Article 2 based on war powers and the president can do stuff because he's president, right? President Obama has not done that. Instead, he's been confronted with a different situation. Rather than dealing with perhaps a war on terror, which he has to deal with, his major obstacle has been Congress. Indeed, Congress has not supported his agenda except for the first 2 years when his party held majorities in both houses. And during his first 2 years in office, he was very successful. He was able to enact the Affordable Care Act, which I have a new book about. He enacted Dodd-Frank. He had the stimulus and the bailout and all these other things, right? When you have 60 votes in the Senate, it's really easy to pass your agenda. But after the 2010 midterm elections, Washington, D.C. became beset by gridlock. Okay, what do I mean by gridlock? Republicans said, screw it, we don't want to support your agenda. Now you may say, well, that's being obstructionist, that's being wrong. But our Constitution, frankly, permits one house of Congress to say we are not going to vote on these bills. So it's in the face of this gridlock, this sort of intransigence, that the Obama theory of executive power has manifested. And during the debate today, I would like to talk about during the domestic sphere and the foreign policy sphere of how President Obama has done executive action and how that will affect what the next president does. So let's start with the domestic front. The primary example where President Obama has relied on executive power is with respect to immigration. This is a very hot topic, always widely debated. So there was a piece of legislation which is a matter of policy I support. It was called the DREAM Act. This bill would have given a path to citizenship for certain minors who came to the United States illegally, or they overstayed a visa, whatever happens to be. This bill actually managed to clear the House of Representatives. It had enough votes. But in the Senate, it was filibustered. And I'll pause briefly, note that a number of Democrats actually joined that filibuster. So the DREAM Act died, right? The president had more than 50 votes to pass in the Senate, but because of the filibuster, he could not hit the 60-vote threshold. What happened next? About 6 or 7 months later, the president announced an executive action known as DACA, D-A-C-A. It stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. What the DREAM Act, what DACA accomplished was it said to these dreamers, right, we will not deport you now. We're going to put you on the bottom of the list for removal. And oh, by the way, we will give you a number of benefits, work authorization among others. That way you can come out of the shadows and become part of the American populace. Right? This is what the president said. These are his words. Was this legal? Fast forward to 2014. At that time, the Senate had passed another big immigration bill called Comprehensive Immigration Reform, also known as the Gang of Eight. This is Marco Rubio's bête noire, right? This is why Rubio perhaps didn't make it too far in the primaries. Under the Gang of Eight compromise, roughly 10 to 15 million aliens have had a pathway to legal citizenship. Again, as a matter of policy, I actually support this bill. But it passed the Senate, but did not pass the House. The House representatives refused to even vote on it. Why? Perhaps anticipating the current wave of anti-immigration sentiment, said, if we vote on this, our members are screwed. So you again had this bill pass the Senate, not the House. You've all seen Schoolhouse Rocks. That is not enough to make a law. Several months later, after the November 2014 midterm elections, President Obama announced a new policy known as DAPA, D-A-P-A, stands for Deferred Action for Parents of Americans and Lawful Permanent Residents. What DAPA did was give this deferred action status not just to the dreamers, but also to the parents of U.S. citizens. That is, if you come to the U.S. and have a child, the child is a citizen by virtue of the Constitution, but the parent is not. The parent has no status at all. DAPA said to the parent of a U.S. citizen, we will not remove you now, and we'll give you this sort of work authorization and what's known as lawful presence. That's how the memo described it, which is in your reading packet. So, were these actions, DACA and DAPA, lawful? And the way I'd like to describe it is in terms of how do we view the relationship between Congress and the president, right? Congress specifically considered a bill that would have adjusted the status of the dreamers. Congress did not do this. Congress has considered a bill that would give status to millions of aliens. It did not pass. So the president did something interesting. He said, well, in these old statutes, the 1980s, these 20-year-old statutes, I've discovered this new font of power that's never been used in this fashion before. Never been used in this fashion before, to grant relief to up to 4 to 5 million aliens who are not in the country with lawful status.
Can you define grant relief?
Grant relief. Yes, granting. Oh, we interrupting each other now?
Just asking for clarification.
It was a granting of what's called lawful presence. If you read the memo, it's in there. And with that comes work authorization, post of other benefits. It does not change their status. So I said relief and not status. But it does provide this sort of lawful presence. So by looking at these old statutes, the president discovered a power that had never before been exercised in this fashion. And had this power been present all along, he could have used it much earlier. This, I humbly argue, was contrary to law. The president was faced with a gridlock Congress that refused to support his agenda. And instead of taking defeat and using it for the next election to perhaps get more members, he used executive action to bypass Congress in the sincere hope that, maybe in the next 2016 election, the next president could enact immigration reform. This didn't go to plan, however, because of a lawsuit filed by then Attorney General, now Governor Abbott, sitting about maybe 2 miles down yonder in the state capitol. Governor Abbott, joined by about 26 other states, challenged the legality of DAPA. And a federal district court in Brownsville, about 7 hours to the south from us here, granted an injunction saying that DAPA was unlawful. The case was appealed to the Fifth Circuit, and by a 2-to-1 margin, the Fifth Circuit said this is unlawful. It went to the Supreme Court. By the time the Supreme Court had considered this issue, they were down to 8 justices. And by a 4-to-4 margin, they split, and they affirmed the decision of the lower court. So as of now, DAPA remains on hold, and it will likely remain on hold until the Supreme Court gets a 9th justice. Maybe we can talk later if that will happen anytime soon. Maybe or maybe not. But the takeaway from this is we have a situation where when Congress says no, the president turns to these very dubious interpretations of statutes to get to his preferred answer. I'd like now to pivot to the foreign realm. And this is a realm where I'm actually much more deferential to the president. Right? On domestic matters such as immigration, I have a strong affinity for Congress, that Congress should make immigration policy. But for the foreign policy, I'm willing to give a little bit more deference to the president, but not here. And I'll focus on 2 major examples. First, Libya, and second, ISIS. So you may recall back in 2011, or maybe you're still in elementary school, however old you guys are. The thing about being a professor is I get older and you stay the same age. It's a weird dynamic. It's true. So back in 2011, we were engaged in military conflicts in Libya. The exact purpose of that, I don't know, maybe Steve can tell us. But ostensibly, we were trying to depose Muammar Gaddafi, who was the ruler of Libya. Congress had never declared war in Libya. The president was acting under a provision of the law known as the War Powers Resolution, right? And the War Powers Resolution grossly stated says the president can use force abroad for up to 60 days, but after that point, if he wants to keep going, he needs to go to Congress, and Congress has to approve it. He can say it for a little bit afterwards, but unless Congress approves, he has to wind down the operations. So there was a weird space in 2011 where the U.S. Congress had no interest in supporting further military incursions in Libya. Good decision, bad decision, that's beyond my ken. But the president had a situation. He was running up to that 60-day clock. He was not able to go past, he was running up to the 60-day clock, and he did not want to leave because they still had not completed their mission. So what happened? We know this through a book by a guy named Charlie Savage, writes for the New York Times, and there was an extensive debate within the administration. So first, the president went to the Department of Defense General Counsel, a guy named Jay Johnson. And Jay Johnson said, Mr. President, as long as we're dropping the bombs and leading this military action, you cannot stay beyond 60 days. Okay. Another opinion came from the Department of Justice, who offers legal counsel, which is like the constitutional lawyer to the president. OLC said the same thing. Mr. President, under our interpretation of the War Powers Act, you cannot stay beyond 60 days. The president didn't like either of those answers, so he turned to a plan C. It's like when mom says no and dad says no, you ask grandpa. The president turned to a law professor, turned legal advisor named Harold Koh, who was the dean of the Yale Law School. And Harold Koh
was the legal advisor to the State Department.
I said that already. I said he was a legal advisor. He was the top.
That sounds like a Joe Schmo first-year lawyer. He was the top lawyer in the State Department.
And he did himself well. So the top lawyer in the State Department, with another lawyer named Bauer, who was the White House counsel, put out this memo. And follow me here, right? The War Powers Resolution says hostilities cannot last more than 60 days without going to Congress. That's where hostilities. Professor Koh, Dean Koh, Advisor Koh, said these are not hostilities. Bombing the crap out of a country from the sky is not hostilities. Therefore, we are not controlled by the War Powers Resolution. Therefore, this is perfectly lawful. We can stay beyond 60 days. Now, if any Professor Koh's students wrote that in an exam, they would get a bad grade. But there are no grades at Yale Law School. They don't actually give grades, so it's actually a moot point. But the president accepted this rationale, which is very dubious. He said, well, beyond 60 days is not hostilities. I don't know. If bombing a country from the sky is not hostilities, then I don't know what the heck is. Keep in mind that both the DOD and the Pentagon and DOJ rejected this understanding. But the president went with it. Hostilities continue beyond the 60-day mark. I'll conclude with a discussion of ISIS, or ISIL, or Daesh, or whatever you want to call them. This is a group of people who are really, really, really bad. And we are engaging in military actions against them. Had Congress ever taken any specific steps to approve action against ISIS? No. Instead, once again, the president turned to old statutes and interpreted them in a way that, frankly, strains credulity. The first one, which you have in your reading packet, is a 2001 authorization for use of force against Al-Qaeda. This was signed right after 9/11 when you guys were. I'm sorry.
Those persons, nations, organizations, or individuals
who were aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th or harbored such organizations or persons. Well, but this was enacted shortly after 9/11 and was widely understood as being a resolution against Al-Qaeda. Now, it's undisputed, right, that ISIS did not exist in 9/11, right? We can discuss the origins group, but it more or less splintered off from Al-Qaeda. In fact, they don't like each other. They're in this battle of who can be the best caliphate in the world, right? Who can control the Levant, so to speak. The president's actually turned to this 2001 AUMF as a justification for force, saying that in fact ISIS is, quote, the true inheritor of Osama bin Laden's legacy. So indeed, they're saying, well, this thing which we used against Al-Qaeda, 10 years ago, we can now use against ISIS. No separate authorization was provided. The second possible ground of attack against ISIS has been the 2002 authorization for force against Iraq, which is in your packet. Again, ISIS is not Iraq. It's not Saddam Hussein. In fact, they're in multiple countries, not just Iraq. So what's the problem here? The president's proposed another AUMF to go against ISIS specifically, but he said it's not necessary. Why is it not necessary? Because he has all the force he needs. So unsurprisingly or poorly, Congress decided not to take any additional votes to authorize force against here. But you're relying on these very strained arguments with these authorizations where Congress is not lacking. And that's been more or less the modus operandi of the Obama presidency, right? Where Congress says no, or Congress stays silent, let me find a different way to do what I would have done anyway. This is dangerous, and I think it sets a very bad precedent. Now, in all likelihood, Hillary Clinton will win the election in 2 or 3 weeks, whenever it happens to be. I cannot wait for this to be over. But at some point, a president will look at these precedents and do something you don't like. Maybe you like President Obama's actions in immigrations, but you can see the same sort of actions being used to perhaps use discretion not to enforce environmental laws, or use discretion not to voice the corporate income tax, or use whatever example you'd like. Perhaps you like the fact that the president is using these authorizations to go against Daesh and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, whoever it happens to be. But maybe one day the president will use his authority to go after a country you don't want to be bombed, and he doesn't go to Congress. Whenever you chip away at the separation of powers, always keep a reality check of how this affects future presidents who achieve policies that you may not like. That is your reality check. I agree with the president's immigration policy. I think he's going about this in an unlawful manner. I think for the most part, he's probably on good ground going after ISIS, but the authorization is simply lacking. And I would much rather he say, you know what, I don't have the power to do this. Congress, give me an authorization, and one will be forthcoming. My time is up. I'll try not to interrupt Steve, but maybe I will. And I thank you all for your attention. Thank you so much.
And I made an ad hoc moderator's decision to give you an extra minute.
Oh, did I take over time? I'm sorry.
Well, no, I gave it to you because you had less than a minute because of
my interruptions.
Right. So
Whoa.
the agreement was to give you 15 minutes, and you had it.
I didn't even notice.
Right. And if that happens, I'll do the same for you.
Give him 16. Give him 16.
I don't need 15 minutes to respond to Josh.
Okay.
Whoa.
Well, in any case, the arrangement was 15 minutes, 15
Okay.
minutes, 5 minutes response. So when
Go.
you're ready, press 5.
Thanks. So I apologize for interrupting, but isn't it more fun that way?
Of course it is.
Okay. So I thought I would start at a slightly higher level. When Jack approached us about having this conversation, it was framed as a discussion about tyranny and concerns about tyrannical government. And so I think we should start by actually defining tyranny and having some sense of what it is that we're so worried about when it comes to executive power. So according to Google, tyranny means cruel and oppressive government or rule. Right, so let's keep that in mind throughout this conversation. Is the government ruling in a manner that is both cruel and oppressive? Right, think about that as we go. All right, so let me start by agreeing with Josh for once.
30 seconds.
Yeah, that there is a meaningful and significant difference between the Obama and Bush approaches to executive power, but let me elaborate a bit on just how important the difference is. It wasn't just that the arguments of the Bush administration when it came to executive power was that the president had all of this inherent unilateral authority under Article 2. The important pivot of that argument was that this power was not only inherent, it was indefeasible. It was preclusive. It was not subject to congressional interference or regulation. And so as a result of that argument, the Bush administration routinely argued that acts of Congress purporting to impose limits on how the president conducted the war on terrorism were unconstitutional, right? Statutes like the one that makes it illegal to torture, statutes that prohibit the detention of US citizens without a specific authorization, statutes that prohibit surveillance without a warrant, right? These were the hallmark arguments of the Bush administration, not just that the president had the power by himself, but that Congress couldn't even stop him. Right, so it's that the Obama administration was reacting to. It's not just unilateral power, it's indefeasible power. And that, I think Josh would agree, is not an argument that we've seen much, if at all, over the last 8 years, to the credit, I think, of the Obama administration. Okay, so I think that's an important place to start in understanding the difference between where we were and where we are today. Now, Josh says Congress has not supported President Obama's agenda. Never were more understated, euphemistic terms used to describe the separation of powers, right? Since 2010, Congress, the Republican leaders in both the House and the Senate, have said their primary domestic agenda item is to not allow Obama to do anything, right? That's not an agenda item. Now, I agree with Josh. Congress has the constitutional right to sit on its hands, right? I am not one of those who thinks that there's some mystical obligation on the part of Congress to legislate or the Senate to confirm nominees. But let's be clear, this is unprecedented refusal, not just to support the president's agenda, but to even support basic things like, oh, I don't know, keeping the government open, paying the bills, right, doing the normal kinds of things that have never been a stumbling block, even during toxic political environments in the past. Why is that important? Because Josh says there's gridlock. There's always gridlock in Washington. For as long as there's been Washington, there's been gridlock. This is not gridlock, right? This is latent obstructionism. Now, don't hear me saying that means the president is therefore entitled to claim power he would not otherwise have. I don't believe there is such a thing as self-help when it comes to the separation of powers. But I think it's important to understand this as the provocation for what the Obama administration did going forward. So Josh talks about all of the important and controversial ways in which the Obama administration has interpreted its various statutory authorities. He skipped over, not because he doesn't agree with it, because he didn't want to emphasize it, one pretty important fact. These are all statutes Congress passed, right? These are all laws Congress put on the books. So the Affordable Care Act is a statute Congress passed. The Immigration and Nationality Act and all of the subsequent amendments there too is a statute Congress passed. The AUMF passed after 9/11, a statute Congress passed. Right, so we have, unlike during the Bush administration, statutory delegations of authority to the president against a backdrop where we have always agreed that the president has a broad amount of enforcement discretion, right? That Congress can in some cases say, no, president, you must carry out this mandate, but in other areas, like, I don't know, war powers, immigration, right, prosecution, Congress has historically given the president the power to pick and choose what his enforcement priorities ought to be. And just to put real numbers on this, in the immigration context, estimates are that there are somewhere over 11 million non-citizens who are legally subject to removal during any given year, right? That in the country right now, about 11 million. 11 million, right? The government says that at the best, if everything runs perfectly, and when have you known anything in Washington to run perfectly?
Obamacare. Sorry.
Exactly. The government, at the best, can remove about 400,000 people, right, from the country in any given year. So I'm not a math major. Oh, wait, I was. 400,000, 11 million. Someone's got to make choices about which are the 400,000 of the 11 million we're going to prioritize. And maybe if Congress had said nothing, this would be a fun separation of powers fight about who should make that choice. Guess who Congress gave that choice to? The president. So is it really that crazy for President Obama to say, listen, Congress, I wanted you to pass a statute to give these guys permanent legal status, but since you haven't, I'm going to take the steps that I can short of that, right, to recognize and to clarify to everyone who's listening, including the state of Texas, that you are not the folks I am prioritizing for removal, and that you should therefore be allowed to work, right, and to contribute to our society as opposed to living in the shadows. We may disagree about whether that is a fair reading of the enforcement discretion Congress delegated to the president. But the key that I want to stress is that's the fight, right? Not whether Congress, by refusing to pass the DREAM Act, has taken this power away from the president, but whether in the absence of the DREAM Act, exercising enforcement discretion in this manner is consistent with the delegation from Congress. That is not a fight about constitutional interpretation. That is not a fight about executive power. That is a perfectly boring, law school sexy fight about statutory interpretation.
His classes are always sexy in law school.
You know, what can I say? All right, especially when Josh comes to visit.
I bring sexy back.
So when Josh says in the context of immigration law that it's Congress who should make policy, I completely agree. And one of the policies Congress made was we're going to leave these hard choices up to the guys who are actually in charge of removing people from the country. That's not us. That's the executive branch. Okay, so when Josh objects to the legality of what he calls the Obama theory of executive power, what he's really objecting to is not a strong claim of executive power remotely resembling the kind of indefeasible, preclusive power that we heard about during the Bush administration. What he's really complaining about is fairly modest claims of statutory interpretation, right? Josh is reading these statutes differently from lawyers in the Obama administration, and we're better off for that, right? That's healthy. We should have fights over statutory interpretation. But here's why that matters. Under the Bush theory of executive power, right, Congress has no authority. Congress has no constitutional entitlement to interfere with what the president is doing. So it wouldn't matter if Congress passed a statute that said, no, Mr. President, no DAPA, no DACA, no AUMF, right? The Bush theory is that Congress is irrelevant to the story. Under the Obama theory, not only can Congress revise or correct or overrule the executive branch's interpretation of these statutes, but in a fight between Congress and the president about what a statute means, courts are supposed to side with Congress. Because the theory of constitutional law is that we are all just faithful agents of the legislature in trying to figure out what a statute means. Okay, now Josh will surely respond, at least before I say what
read my mind.
Josh will surely respond by noting that the president has the constitutional authority to veto any of the bills Congress would pass that would try to rein in his power in these areas. And of course he's right. I mean, I wouldn't be able to, pass common law if I didn't think that that was true.
Even as a math major.
Even as a math major. Well, vetoes take votes, you have to count the votes. But guys, a couple of interesting points. Congress hasn't tried to force the issue, right? I mean, we talk about all the times that the House of Representatives has voted to repeal the ACA. Interesting that the quote is always the number of times the House has voted to repeal the ACA. There has never been a bill sent to President Obama's desk to repeal the ACA. He would surely veto it, but it hasn't even happened. So I'm not sure we can have this whole conversation based upon things that haven't happened. Second, in a dire enough case, Congress can override President Obama's veto. Indeed, they just did it 2 weeks ago on an unrelated bill that was really kind of stupid. So the larger
Tell us how you really think.
If you really want to know what I think about JOSTA?
I think I agree with you.
Well, there we go. That's twice. Right? What I'm trying to say to you guys, right, is that this is not actually some great contest for the future of executive power. Rather, this is a conversation about Congress's role, not just in delegating power to the president ab initio, but in continuing to exercise some say in what that power means. Now, Congress's response lately has been, if we don't like what the president's doing, we'll sue him. Right? And so, for example, there's a case—
Sue his subordinates. I'm not suing the president directly. The suing is as secretaries.
Because that's a really important difference in this conversation.
It is.
No, it's a difference for sovereign immunity purposes, right? But we'll sue the executive branch because constitutionally what the framers thought would happen is when there was a disagreement between the legislature and the president, Congress would sue the president. That was how it was supposed to work. Right? The problem, the animating problem, the reason why we are having this conversation, the reason why people are nervous about executive power under the next president has nothing to do with executive power and everything to do with Congress. Okay? This Congress is on pace to pass the fewest bills of any Congress in American history.
Libertarian dream.
Harry Truman, you guys may remember, once derided I think it was the 90th Congress as the so-called do-nothing Congress. The do-nothing Congress passed 906 bills, right? This Congress is in the low 200s. So if we're going to talk about responsibility and institutional action here, again, let's put the blame where the blame lies. I'm not saying, again, Congress has an obligation to pass bills, but if we're really going to go around saying that the presidents are claiming tyrannical versions of executive power, maybe Congress should actually do something about it as opposed to filing a lawsuit. All right, so really quickly running through the statutes. The AUMF, right? Josh is right. It is a little bit strained to read into the AUMF the power to go after ISIS. But imagine it's World War II, all right? And imagine that Germany splits into two states, right? Germany and Schmermany. And that they both have Nazi-ish ideology at the head, right? Heydrich goes off and starts a splinter state in Czechoslovakia. Would we really think that the declaration of war against Germany didn't cover Schmermany just because it changed its name and it was a splinter state? No, right? So what we're really fighting about is the factual claim here. Is ISIS really an offshoot of Al-Qaeda? I don't know the answer to that question, right? I suspect Josh does not know the answer to that question. But if Congress thinks the answer is no, Congress has remedies, right? Congress not only has the ability to pass legislation, Congress has 22 different versions of an AUMF for ISIS that have been introduced, along with the one introduced by the president. So that's the fight there. On the War Powers Resolution, I agree with Josh. I think that the Obama administration adopted a pretty strained interpretation of hostilities vis-a-vis Libya. Guess what the solution is? Congress, amend the War Powers Resolution. Congress hasn't touched the War Powers Resolution since 1973. And on the INA, I think if Congress really wants to get into the business of micromanaging how the United States does immigration policy, we're going to go back to the bad old days, right? Where Congress spent half of its time passing something called private bills to deal with individual immigrants on an individual case-by-case basis, okay? Unless your objection is to the administrative state writ large, it seems to me that there's going to be necessary elements of enforcement discretion. And do we really disagree that President Obama has picked the right categories of immigrants to prioritize for not removing them? All right, so all this in conclusion is just to say, reasonable minds can surely disagree about which of these interpretations of these statutes is the correct one, right? That's fine, that's healthy. But that is not a debate about tyranny, right? And if we're really gonna try to place blame, it's not blame that should be placed on President Bush or President Obama or either of the major party candidates for president right now. It's blame that should be placed on Congress, which apparently thinks that it no longer has to do its job. And on that note, I will shut up.
Do your job. Thank you. Thank you. Hashtag do your job. Thank you. It's always a clap.
Okay, so 5 minutes.
5 minutes. And if you need to go, please be quiet when you leave. So I'm grateful to Steve for always putting issues in focus, and we do agree on a lot. And in fact, as a libertarian, I'm actually with him on his critique of the Bush administration's reading of the inherent powers of the commander-in-chief. I'd like to focus my 5 minutes rebuttal on this notion of discretion. The president has a lot of discretion. As Steve mentioned, with respect to immigration, there are probably about 11 or 12 million people subject to removal. And Congress has only given him the authority to remove about 400,000 people. You get no argument from here, right? You cannot remove 11 million when there's only enough money to remove 400,000. Indeed, I think it'd be a humanitarian disaster to, load up buses and start bringing 12 million people. I mean, it'd be an
economic disaster.
It'd be horrible. It'd be a stupid idea all around. But that doesn't end the discussion. If you actually get into the weeds of the Immigration Act, Congress has been very specific about how this practice of deferred action can be used. And one of the measures of a president's authority is how have past presidents used it in the past. There is no example of a president ever using authority in this manner. Now, Steve will respond to rebuttal. What about President Bush and President Reagan? There were instances in which maybe 30 or 40,000 people were given deferred action. Not 1.5 million, that number was never actually real. But it was under an earlier statute that Congress repealed in 1996 called extended voluntary departure. That's out. So under the practice of deferred action, which has basically existed since the Clinton administration, we've never had a case where the president decided to an entire class, I will give you this. Here's how it's been used in the past. I'll give you a very easy example. In 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf, imagine you were a foreign exchange student at Tulane University in New Orleans. You were a student, you had lawful status, the university got shut down because of the hurricane. You lost your status. You were then subject to removal. What President Bush said was, I will give you this deferred action for a few months if you enroll at another university, get your credit load back up, and then you get your status again.
Do you have the power to do that?
Deferred action has been used as a bridge from one status to another, and Congress has in fact acquiesced to that. I think let me finish. I think it's a valid usage of deferred action as a bridge from one status to another. That is the framework in which deferred actions existed for the last 20 years or so. That is not how President Obama has been using it. He's been using it not as a bridge, but as a tunnel. The people who are getting DACA or DAPA have no pathway to citizenship, unless, for example, a parent waits 21 years till a child gets a visa, and there's a superseding statutory cause. This is used as a way to bypass a Congress that will change the law. Now, Steve says, well, why can't Congress just change the law, pass a new statute, even over the veto? That's not how this works. Congress already passed a statute. They don't need to pass a statute saying, we really mean it. They don't need to pass a statute saying, that's what we really wanted. But when the president can interpret stuff and then throw the burden back to Congress to pass a new and indeed redundant statute, I think it's insufficient. I'll disclose. I'm sorry. I'll disclose. I'll close with a note, though. One of the reasons I think why Congress has had this sort of intractable fighting is that there's a strong disagreement about priorities. The Affordable Care Act is perhaps a leading example. This is a law that's never peaked above 50% popularity. There's a large percentage of the population who hates the law. There's a certain number of people who benefit from it, maybe 10 to 15 million people, 20 million, depending how you count. But a lot of other people haven't benefited from it. So why do we simply assume that a law that was passed on a straight party line vote will all of a sudden get the support of the other party? There was not any buy-in because Republicans wanted nothing to do with it, which is why they have no problem trying to repeal it and taking these meaningless votes that go, frankly, nowhere. But this gridlock is really a symptom of a far larger disease, perhaps we can call it, of the American populace disagreeing. And perhaps in my remaining minute, I'll discuss partyism. So every year, a survey is conducted that asks, would you be okay with your son or daughter marrying somebody of the opposite race? And you can imagine in the 1960s, people were saying, absolutely not. Fortunately, that number has gone down, right? People are okay with interracial marriage. Thank you. There's a wonderful progress society. But another question is asked, would you be okay with your son or daughter marrying some of the opposite political party? As if you're Republican, what if your son marries a Democrat and the other way around? That number is going up. So while perhaps we're becoming more racially tolerant, Donald Trump rallies perhaps accepted, I think there may be a case where we're becoming party tolerant, where there's just a strong hatred among people disagree, which is why I like Steve so much, right? I don't agree with him, he doesn't agree with me, but I respect his opinion, he respects mine, with these wonderful debates. But in Congress, that ain't true. And in large population of the American, that's not true. And people cannot even agree to disagree. I don't see Congress having any sort of meaningful discourse going forward. Thank you so much. I look forward to answering your questions after Steve eviscerates me. Thank you.
Time exactly. Thank you.
Ooh, good timing. Yeah.
Right.
Mental clock.
Yay. So I have 3 quick responses to Josh, besides, yes, I agree with everything. Josh says, Congress doesn't need to pass a statute to say that we really mean it. They do it all the time, right? Congress does not, in most cases, pass legislation that is entirely clear. Sometimes it's because there's no consensus on what the law should be. Sometimes because Congress can't be bothered. Sometimes it's just they make mistakes and they write language. There's a great case from 2005 where Congress passed a statute where the word less actually meant more, right? It happens, right? This is how multi-member legislative bodies work. Congress has to clarify things all the time. Why are we scared of it? And indeed, why is that proof that we have some kind of tyrannical run on executive power? Josh says the real issue, the divisiveness comes from strong disagreement over priorities. I am one of those who thinks that this is not the most politically divided the United States has ever been. We weren't there for the 1860 election, but it was pretty bad, right?
And that turned out.
But, yeah, and you know what? Guess what Congress did in the 1860s after the Civil War? Guess what Congress did in the 1850s before the Civil War? The Great Compromise, right, was a compromise. It wasn't a lack of legislation. The Great Compromise was not we sit on our hands and do nothing. It was we all give a little to get what we want. You have to govern to compromise, right? If Congress is not even going to come to the table, this is not a conversation. Josh says the source of gridlock is our growing disagreement, is the partisan entrenchment. I could not disagree more vehemently. The source of our gridlock is the polarization of our electoral process.
Who votes for them?
Can I? I don't know, but I'll tell you who votes for them. You know who votes for them? Not the American people, because of gerrymandering, right? If you guys want to look at, I mean, there are 435 House seats up for election on November 8th. Do you guys know how many of them are competitive? Fewer than 10%.
What about the Senate?
What about the Senate?
It's not gerrymandered.
No, but you need both houses, my friend, as I think you know, right? So the House is completely gerrymandered to the point where now the only way you can be elected to the House is to win your primary. How do you win a primary? Do you win a primary by appealing to the centrists, to the moderates, to the compromising elements in your party? Or do you win a primary by going all the way to the radical wings, either of the Republican or Democratic Party, depending on the district? You guys know the answer to that question. And so the result is that people like Senator Lindsey Graham, who is a pretty moderate Republican who actually likes to compromise, will get pilloried and will not be able to win his primary in South Carolina if he does anything to cross the aisle. All right? So when Josh says we have gridlock because of disagreement, I say no, we have gridlock because politicians no longer, House members especially, need to win general elections, they need to win primaries. And that's directly because of gerrymandering and the fact that we don't actually have competitive races in 90% of our elections across the country. All right? So the question is, how do we fix this? The answer is not to scale back executive power. The answer is not to impose new limits on future presidents for situations we can't think about. The answer is to look at how we choose the people who represent us. And the answer is to think about whether we actually have a fair system for picking those folks who are then going to turn around and sit on their hands for 6 years. Why was Congress able to get away with doing nothing for 6 years? Why has the Senate been able to get away with not acting on President Obama's nominee to replace Justice Scalia? The answer is because it is no longer important to run to the middle in this country. And until we fix that, this is going to be a problem that has nothing to do with executive power and everything to do with the nature of American democracy. Thank you very much.
We need to make America great again. Oh, wait.
We've had experienced debaters who crossed swords before, and maybe there was some metallic sound across the board right here. You had a robust debate on the nature and limits of executive power and immigration war, and now you have a chance to ask the directors. So if you have any questions, I'll moderate kind of posturing for a particular candidate, which I really what do you have? I must have a question from one or either, both of them. Other than asking them to go at it again, that's not really what
If you're interested, we're doing this again tomorrow at UT Austin Law School at noon. We're debating the Supreme Court in the election, so this is like round one.
Anyone have any questions for either or both? Yes, sir, go ahead.
My name is Austin Campbell. You talked about gerrymandering, polarization of the houses, just how. So basically, my question is, with the increase of our generation, can it be a two-party system last for the next year?
It's a great question. There's a really good political scientist whose name I'm forgetting, maybe you remember, who actually has a paper explaining why the nature of our system redounds to the benefit of two parties, right? How it's actually inevitable that the way our electoral system is currently constituted, there will be two parties. It'll be really hard for there to be a third party. I don't know if that's going to be true. I mean, I think if things follow the current polling, I'm not endorsing, I'm just saying if the current polling holds up.
His baby wears a Hillary onesie, by the way.
She's endorsing. She's not here, right? I think the Republican Party is going to have an interesting choice, and I think the question is going to be whether we move toward three parties. That would have to happen, of course, right at the House level, right, even at the state level, before it could really, I think, seep into the federal system. I think there are very high barriers to entry, which is why I think we're looking at a two-party system at least for the next 10 to 15 years. But if there's really enough belief that the two parties can't speak for enough cross sections of the country anymore, sure, I think we can see the rise of a real third party. The question is going to be, is it a third party that's just in between the Democratic and Republican parties, or is it a third party that actually has a weird amalgamation, right? Maybe a more libertarian, liberal, what Congressman Labrador called the Wingnut Coalition. That's going to be the real question.
Do you want to take that?
Sure. If there was ever, I'm a libertarian, right? If there was ever a year where a libertarian candidate could have made an impact, it was this year. Well, the Republican. Unfortunately, Garrett Johnson is unsure where Aleppo is, and he's made another blunders that.
What's Aleppo?
What? I forget where it is. What it is. So that's why I'm not voting for president this year. That's why I can't endorse anyone. I don't have a candidate. But there's a real divide. I mean, look. So you have the kind of called the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. You have the Hillary Clinton wing, and they don't agree on a lot of things. And then you have kind of the maybe Paul Ryan wing of the Republican Party, and the Donald Trump alt-right wing of the Republican Party. There's significant fractures within the party. And after this election, everything's said and done, I think there ought to be some sort of reconciliation of these various parties. The bigger question beyond just the House is also the filibuster. I'm surprised you didn't raise that. Due to the filibuster in the Senate, unless you get to 60 votes, basically nothing gets done. So the ACA was passed in this brief interregnum where there were 60 votes in the Democratic caucus. I think there's a distinct chance, maybe Steve will agree, that if Clinton wins the White House and the Senate, the filibuster is not long for this world, so they can go enact bold new policies and all manner of things. So if you have, even if you can't get redistricting done, if you're the filibuster, it's significantly easier to pass legislation.
I do think, I certainly think that a Democratic-controlled Senate will get rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominations.
Yes, agreed.
I'm not nearly as convinced that they'll get rid of the filibuster for ordinary legislation. But even if they do, I'm fine with that. The filibuster is a completely anti-democratic, anti-representative constraint on governance. And then why is this a problem? It's not just that the filibuster means you need 60 votes to get anything through. Guys, think about the Senate. Right? That means that 41 senators can stop anything from happening in this country. If you pick the 41 senators from the 21 smallest states, right, that is about 14% of the population.
Steve doesn't like the Connecticut Compromise, right?
So at the time of the founding, 2/5 of the Senate at the time of the founding was about 40% of the population, shockingly enough, because the country was more evenly distributed. So no, I don't like the Connecticut Compromise added to the filibuster, right? Now, whether half of the Senate should still be representative enough is a different problem. But when 14% of the country can stop any legislation from happening, that's not the Constitution, that's the Articles of Confederation. And that didn't work out so well.
Right. So this is the constitutional compromise. You know, this was called the so-called Connecticut Compromise, right?
The filibuster was not part of the Connecticut Compromise.
Give him some history, Steve. Come on. So the Senate was designed that each state, regardless of population, would have 2 senators, and the House, regardless of population, would have 1. And this was a compromise between the bigger states and the smaller states to actually achieve ratification. Oh, was it?
Was it the smaller states, or were the smaller states, or were a particular group of states worried about losing power in the House because of shifting demographic patterns?
I'm going to have you return to the history lesson in a minute. If there are more questions, would you go first, please?
Going back to gerrymandering, I would love to hear your thoughts about independent redistricting commissions. I know that currently 6 states really have them and actually have shown some type of increased competitiveness in congressional election and increased voter turnout. So I would be interested in how y'all think about
You go first, Steve.
I am a huge fan of what we call IRCs. I think it's a really, really useful, if not perfect, innovation.
Can you say what they do?
So basically, the Constitution, if we're going back to common law,
of course,
dictates that it is up to the legislature.
See, he's out of his pocket. He's a federal citing Constitution. I'm so proud of you.
There's some stuff missing in there. Dictates that the legislature of a state is in charge of controlling elections, setting the rules for the time, place, and manner of elections, including the districts. A number of states have, by constitutional amendment, taken that power away from the legislature, which runs into its own gerrymandering problems, and given it to an independent redistricting commission on the theory that an independent commission that doesn't have to run for office is more inclined to draw fair and proportionate and relatively representative district lines. The best example I have so far, where if you look at how the races are going in Arizona in this election cycle, it's a lot more competitive than it had been in prior cycles. Now, this actually led to its own Supreme Court case because the Arizona state legislature sued and said, wait a second, we are the Arizona state legislature. It's unconstitutional for the people of the state of Arizona to take that power away from us and give it to 15 guys in a room over there. And the Supreme Court last year ruled 5-4. The answer was no. The people of Arizona could totally do that.
Unconstitutional.
Because the legislature is this thing not created by the people of Arizona?
The legislature is a legislature.
According to whom?
Constitution.
So if the people of Arizona had just called the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission the state legislature for purposes of redistricting, then it would be constitutional?
There is a legislator as a term of art, which is understood to be the thing you vote for. People serve in it, not the independent commission, which is separate from it.
But can't the people of the state, by constitutional amendment, have a legislature be whatever they want it to be?
But then it's not the legislature if there's independent commission.
I
That's not the
disagree.
people elected.
I completely disagree.
And that's why it's 5-4.
A legislature is whoever the people of the state decree it to be. I mean, let me sort of take back from the interpretation, right? The question is, who have the people chosen to represent them? The people of Arizona chose an independent commission to represent them for the purposes of redistricting. Josh's position is that they don't get to do that. Right? That seems to me to be a very craven view of popular control of the electoral
We don't have a
process.
democracy. We have a republic, so I'm not a big fan of democracy.
A republic where people choose who's going to represent them.
In government, they don't
Indeed,
choose
in
independent
government.
commissions.
Anyway, your question was not about the Supreme Court case, right? I think this is a really positive development. I think it's not the end solution, right? But I think it's an important intermediate step. I'm very happy that the Supreme Court did not stand in the way last year.
Josh, you want to address the IRC issue?
Look, I think the state legislature can draw districts however they want. If they have enough common will.
Really? Subject to race?
That's not what I meant. I think they can
You
choose
say however
it.
they want.
Well, we can go back to Reynolds v. Sims later. And one person went up. I think the legislature has discretion, and if the people in that state and the people they vote for decide they want to do it in a more competitive fashion, they're free to do that. I think the reason why I've only seen 6 states do this is that politicians have a general incentive to keep themselves in office, which is why you see these sort of hexagonal, long, snake-shaped districts that wind through Texas. I think Austin maybe has a couple of them around here.
Are you kidding? I'm represented. Have you guys ever looked at Lamar Smith's district?
Yeah.
Right. I'm represented by Lamar Smith. The district is like the weirdest 947-sided polygon you've ever seen in your life.
And the next big issue, this is something perhaps the Supreme Court may address given another liberal vote or two, is partisan gerrymandering, not racial gerrymandering. But there's been a movement afoot to say that even partisan gerrymandering, the sort of thing that Steve described, is unconstitutional. And the court so far has resisted any efforts against that sort of thicket. But that may be something that the court enters depending on what happens in the future.
So are you for IRCs?
I don't know. I really don't have a strong opinion on them, but I think the decision that the Arizona case was wrongly decided.
Other questions? Yes, please, Scott.
Well, if you're not for IRCs, then.
I said I don't know. I don't have an opinion on them.
If you're undecided about IRCs.
I'm undecided. I really haven't studied them closely enough.
Okay, but if you're undecided about IRCs, then how would you go about, like, I think this is a big question, the big sticking problems of like gerrymandering in our country, because if our elected officials have like a vested interest in keeping themselves in office, then there's obviously a conflict of interest. Like they're not going to twist it so that it's fair. So then how do we make it fair, or are we just powerless?
Steve and I had this mini discussion at the outset. I don't know the future prospects of our representative republic are so bright, and it alludes to the sort of sectionalism I described before. I know that's somewhat of a pessimistic message, but because the parties have indeed become so polarized and there's a strong disagreement, you mentioned 1860, I don't think we're headed to some sort of violent civil war, although maybe Operation Jade Helm kicks up with we'll have some more military action, the Walmart and everything. But to the extent that the House of Representatives remains divided, and maybe have more competitive races will be fixed, but the people in those districts still are pretty divided. I don't know what breaks the logjam. I think a lot of it will depend on what happens after this election and what is sort of what's built from the ashes of the Republican Party. I think after this election, it's going to be in pretty sorry shape. And there may, in fact, be schisms where, you know, some of the more moderate Republicans go to the Hillary's wing, and the Bernie people go their wing, and you have the alt-right people. So your three-party question before may be valid. But in our current construct, I don't see a unilateral disarmament. Now, whether the House be redistricted in 2020, that depends who's controlling the House. And it looks like the Republicans will probably keep the House for the foreseeable future, which means we don't get redistricting for another decade after the next census. So I'm not too optimistic that this sort of logjam can be broken. The only cherry in the icing as a libertarian, when you say Congress has passed the fewest bills in whatever number of years, I'm like, yay, fewer laws is good. But they're all, he's shaking his head. But you know, that's somewhat idiosyncratic.
It's not idiosyncratic. I mean, I think in a different time and place, it would have been a perfectly defensible position.
Not here though.
Well, I mean, I think look at the world around you, right? I mean, I resist the notion that not legislating is neutral, right? That it is sort of taking a neutral position on the role of government. It's not, right? Now, I think the real question, just sort of what happens next. The real question, if the polls hold without endorsing any particular candidate, is whether Republicans in the House are going to work with the new president, or whether we're going to see the same kind of complete obstructionism that we saw for the last 6 years. Now, you know, I think a President Clinton would be a very different figure than a President Obama, right? I think her time in the Senate was marked by bipartisan compromise and crossing the aisle. And I think she might be inclined to not force the issue on high-profile, controversial social policy issues like healthcare, the way that President Obama was.
Oh, you think she'd be more moderate with her agenda?
I think she's going to be more bipartisan with her agenda, frankly. Especially if she knows that she has to get it through a Republican House controlled by, you know, a speaker who is the leading candidate for the Republican nomination in 2020. But guys, also, but there's a different, just to tie this back to the theme of this debate, right? The theme of this debate was presidential power, okay? To me, the most important consequence for this conversation of an election where Hillary wins and the Democrats retake the Senate is that the justice who fills Scalia's seat on the court is going to be a justice who is deeply in line with broad theories of deference to the executive, right? And with broad theories of presidents being able to interpret statutes capaciously to encompass what they view as domestic policy priorities. You know, I think a President Clinton would actually be more like Obama than Bush insofar as how she approached the Article II executive power question. But then the question is, would that finally motivate Congress to, if you'll forgive my French, get off of its ass, right, and actually do its job. Because Josh says the problem is like we have this insufferable gridlock and everyone's just too polarized. I think the problem is that it's become too politically attractive to Republicans in Congress to do nothing. And the question is, at what point do the politics, not the policies, change? And I think that's going to be at the point where the inability of the government to get anything done starts to affect everyday Americans in a way that's palpable.
I think that in the interest of time, and don't yet, I want to leave it there. If you have a question you do not need to ask, they're still here. Please come up and ask your book. But if you heard a, in some ways, starkly different view about what the president, whoever that person, him or her, is next, we'll do.
It'll be her.
I'm not making predictions. I'm no truster of the poll. These are the debate silver.
And Nate Silver we trust. Nate Silver for president.
So let's thank our debaters.